Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harin. I am security lead for MySQL server engineering team, and I'm going to talk about enhancement over the past 2 years in MySQL server security. We'll explain certain rationale behind some of the features we have introduced, why we have introduced, and what it brought us, and in addition, what is the additional advantage it brought us. So, yeah. Oh my God. I don't have the right presentation.
This is kind of a security, yeah?
It's too secret to tell us.
Yeah. All right. I already talked about this. I'm in server engineering team since 2012, primarily working on security area, working on authentication, authorization, auditing, firewall, all the features which are available in server. And part of it on libMySQL client as well, because C client is also managed by MySQL server engineering team. What we are going to talk about is what we have introduced in past couple of years, rationale behind it, and once we introduce it, what additional benefit those features are providing us. And there's no particular order. I'm just going to talk about, breadth of the features. I'm not going to focus on one thing. So I'm going to touch something on authentication, user management, why we are migrating to components, and some of our latest components. We'll also talk about some of the usability enhancement that we have introduced, and deprecation removal. Fair warning, part of this features will be available only in Enterprise Edition or to the Cloud Edition as well. But yeah, that's how it is. All right, so let's jump in. The first topic that I would like to show today is about authentication enhancement. And we will start with multi-factor authentication support in MySQL. Our prime rationale was to protect administrative account better, because we just have a password, and if it's not that secure to use a single password and allow user to log in. Even now, you can see that, each and every system is asking for a second factor authentication. So why not do that in database as well? So we are focusing on two things. One is something you know, which is your password. And other thing is either something you have or something you are. So like a YubiKey that you have, or a fingerprint, or retina scan, or whatever is supported by your system. To implement this, we are using lib502, and thanks to it, we can interface with YubiKeys and also the Windows Hello. Again, because it's multi-factor authentication requires a user present, it cannot be used in non-interactive manner, which is understood. I mean, we don't expect this feature to be used for each and every server account that you create, only for those which are critical and you want additional security configured. It works in two modes. The first is when you create the account, configure it, or the DBA creates the account, it will run into kind of a sandbox mode, which will allow end user to come in, configure the second factor authentication part. And once that is done, it will give the full access to the system, which is the normal working. It requires three things. It requires configuring authentication policy. By the way, news, authentication policy replaces default authentication plugin variable, and it allows you to configure server to use certain plugins, certain factors, and how do you want to enforce those policies. So you need to configure the authentication policy. You need to create an account which utilizes the multi-factor authentication, which in this case will look something like this. The first factor is your regular caching SHA-2 password, and then you say that, hey, that's okay, but in addition to it, you also use a second factor authentication provided by authentication relevant. it requires a whole lot of changes, right? I mean, it's not, so MySQL server typically goes to the client, asks for credentials. Once that is sent back to the server, we allow user to do any SQL. But now you need another layer which will say that, yes, you passed the first factor. Now I want the detail for the second factor. I want the detail for the third factor. So it requires changes on server side, client side, even on the protocols. So as I say, because of the lib502, we support 5.2 devices and Windows Hello. Typical usage of this feature that we have seen is the first is credential, which is stored in MySQL, and the second is a device which a user has. So when a user starts in registration phase, just after the account is created, they get very limited access. The only thing they can do is configure the second factor or third factor authentication. Once that is done, every time user logs in, user has to provide a password. If the password is correct, user will be prompted to provide the second factor authentication credential, which is probably a YubiKey. So you touch your YubiKey, or if it's Windows Hello, you touch the fingerprint sensor or enter a pin on your Windows device, and then system allows you to go through. So
how's that handled since the user's never on the same server? So you've obviously got networking or something between where the user is some actual. Like, how's that transport between that and
right. So that's done during registration phase. So what happens on registration phase is MySQL client tool has been enhanced to support registration phase of this second factor or third factor authentication. And as a part of that, it will interact with your YubiKey or Windows Hello, which in turn will generate a unique asymmetric key pair, and then it will send the public key back to the server.
Okay.
So the next time, whenever a request comes in the normal working, the request is signed by the private key, which is locally stored on user's hardware, which is YubiKey or Windows Hello, and then you can verify it on the server side because you have the public key. Alright? Right. So that's about the multi-factor authentication. Yes.
You said this was so that the MySQL client was modified to support that MySQL shell 2 also?
I believe so, yes.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. Alright. So, okay. In fact, all the connectors are, including Python, Java. Yes, please.
Are you able to identify which features are going to be enterprise only versus?
Okay, I haven't, but I'll keep on mentioning.
Yeah.
So this is an enterprise feature.
Enterprise only.
Yeah.
Like,
This is authentication web authent, which is available in enterprise.
could it be done through PAM? I mean, if you had a PAM plugin that plugged into MySQL, would that work as well? With PAM could happen. In theory.
I haven't tried it. In theory, it should, but I haven't tried it. Okay. Would be interesting. Question. Right, but as I said, I mean, this was the first motivation behind it, but it brings something extra. So while user support for multi-factor authentication, it also provides us ability to support passwordless login. So what you can now do is you can eliminate the caching SHA-2 or, for that matter, any password that you store on server altogether. So you create an account which you want only with the authentication web authent, but you then configure that, yeah, but initially you identify it with a random password. And this random password is used only in the registration phase. Once the registration is over, once you have generated your public-private key pair on your YubiKey or Windows Hello device, and the public key is sent back to the server, from the next time onward, during the normal working when the user logs in, there's no need to provide a password. So once you try to log in, server will send you a response back saying that you need to provide me a challenge which is signed with your private key, assuming that you have a client which is capable of interfacing with lib502 device. You touch your device or you use your fingerprint or whatever, and you log into the database.
Yeah. When you talk about the registration phase and you say sending the public key to the server, how would this work in an environment where there are many servers, like in replication or in a sharded database, how do you go from server to servers with that?
Right. So, okay, great question. There's something called a RPID, which is essentially a unique ID associated with MySQL. As long as that is same on all your replicas, the login will work seamlessly on all of it. So you just have to make sure that if you have a replication setup, or you have a GR setup, at all places where you install the WebAuthn plugin, you set the RPID as one. The RPID is essentially the unique ID that identifies on your FIDO device which key to fetch from.
And the public key needs to be known on all servers.
Yes, so that will be taken care of once you finish your registration phase. So registration phase is nothing but behind the scene, it runs an alter user command. And the alter user command will obviously be bin log. So whatever you have put in your primary will replicate seamlessly on your replica. And from that point onward, even if you try and connect to, let's say, secondary or your replica, it should just work.
Yeah. So that registration phase happens on the primary
That's the assumption, yes.
or on a group
Or on a group.
application. And so this works in a primary replica architecture. Now let's assume that I am sharded and I have 10 primary replica side by side, and 10 primaries, each of them adding n replicas. Will I need to redo the registration phase on each of the 10?
No, you would have to somehow pass this information to all your primaries.
Okay, so we basically need some sort of authentication, replication.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Whatever is being done to pass the information from primary to replica, you will have to do the same on the other side.
But effectively, show create user or something might have enough information.
It would have it.
You could just apply that somewhere else and
Yes.
solve it. That.
Once the registration is done and you do show create user, that should contain everything that you need to
Okay.
transfer.
Yeah.
So if I have many replication
Mm-hmm.
clusters,
Yeah.
I would probably want people to do the registration phase on a specific cluster
Yes.
that copies this.
Yes. And then behind the scene, you run your orchestration to copy it everywhere else. Because if you do it multiple times, only the last one remains. Everything else gets, over it. Right. So, yeah. So, not only multi-factor authentication, but with the same feature, we achieve passwordless. So, you eliminate password altogether, which is the ultimate goal, I think. The second thing in authentication area that we did is what we identified that all cloud service providers have a centralized identity management service. Potentially, this service can also interface with your on-premise authentication server and can help you, not shift everything to the cloud, but interface with your on-premise server and use whatever you were using. Now, MySQL, the Enterprise Edition, already interacts with LDAP, Kerberos, PAM, Windows authentication, so on and so forth. But what we lack was we don't have support for any of the cloud identity provider. So that's something we need to work on. That's what we worked on some time back. The first thing we worked on, and this is available in OCI HeatWave service because this is tightly coupled with Oracle OCI's identity service, is to support OCI identity with MySQL server. The way it works is that you create a user on OCI identity, using OCI identity, and then you use same account to log into MySQL. It works in two ways. When you create a user in OCI identity, it gives you an API key, sort of a public-private key, which you get access to. You can use this key pair to log into MySQL. If you don't want to use your public-private key pair, which is quite understandable because it's like the secret, you can also generate ephemeral tokens. And ephemeral tokens is something that's valid only for a finite amount of time, and then it just goes away. Even if you present it, identity will reject it. So both ways we can log into MySQL Server behind the scene. So the expectation is that when you log into MySQL Server, you either have already generated ephemeral token through OCI identity, or you have your API key. There's a challenge response mechanism that happens between MySQL Server and client. You use your keys to sign the challenge, send it back to server. Server will in turn verify your credential against OCI identity and allows you to log in or rejects the claim. The good part about this is OCI identity supports groups, and we can map these groups to MySQL proxy users. So you can say that a user belonging to certain OCI identity groups can only have this many privileges because they map to a particular proxy account on MySQL server. In addition, as I say, cloud identity provider also interface with your on-premise identity servers, which OCI does too through something called OCI identity domains. So you get it for free. It's transparent once it is set up. But again, this was just specific to MySQL Heatwave service on OCI. We could do it even more by supporting OpenID Connect on-premise. This is again an enterprise feature, but it allows all the on-premise enterprise server to use the OpenID Connect functionality, which by the way is supported by almost all major cloud providers. We use similar concept with one exception, that you cannot support the proxy because OpenID Connect tokens format does not mandate that group information is also part of the token. That's an optional information. So unless standard mandates it, you can't really use that information. So again, user will go to an identity provider, get a token, pass that token back to MySQL, which has the knowledge of public key of the provider and can verify the identity token. Validity of it allows you to log in. One key thing to note here is you need a secure connection between server and client. TLS is mandatory because this identity token is essentially your password. So if you try to log in with it on a plain channel, you are essentially giving it away. So client will ensure that the connection is secure before passing it to the server. And server will reject it if it's coming from an insecure channel. Right, so that's about authentication enhancements. We will now move on to the next section, which is account security improvements. One of the first things that we did in past few years is to make sure that we have one more step or one more restriction when you're changing your password. So it should be possible to specify the existing password, or it should be mandatory to specify existing password if you want to change your current password to the new one. And by the way, this is community feature. Somebody asked me to call out. This is community feature. This is done through something called password require current. That's a clause in your create user or alter user syntax. Specify it, and you can make it configurable like for every password change, you provide your current password, whether you follow a global policy or you make it optional. It works on accounts which are using MySQL user table for password storage, which is currently caching SHA-2. If you are using external authentication, this does not apply to you. But well, again, does it provide us something else? So till now, while changing the password, MySQL server didn't know anything about the previous password. But with the require password current, now we know about the current password. So can we do more? How many of you have used validate password component? Obviously you have. No? You have? Okay, good. So password validation component right now focuses on criteria like your password should have uppercase character, lowercase character, special character, so on and so forth. Now that we know the current password, we can also match it against the new password that user is setting and try to prevent something if user is trying to be clever, like, changing few characters here and there to just specify or satisfy the password criteria, or, just changing certain words position, so on and so forth. So we can now say that you can now specify in terms of percent on how much new password should be changed with respect to the current password. So it should be 10%, 50%, 70%, so on and so forth. And it's case insensitive, doesn't really care where the particular letter appears. It enforces certain percent of characters, 100% change when you supply the new password. Right. So that's about the account security. The next one is migration to keyring component. We already have keyring plugins. We now have component systems. So the idea is to migrate to keyring components. Reason? Make it hard to change configuration accidentally. So far, keyring components depend on system variables which can be set at runtime, which means that you can change your security model at runtime through a remote DB. We didn't want to do that. We want to tie the security of keyring with the file system. So we basically make sure that an admin account which has access to the local host can only create certain changes in the keyring. The second criteria is make it reusable so that not only server, but any binary should be able to use it. It should be generic enough because it can be useful on the client side as well. The way we did it is on the server side, we introduced a concept called manifest file. In simple word, it's a way to load plugin very, very early or load a component very, very early in Bootstrap sequence. Right after, it's probably 10th or 15th line in the main code. So we haven't even read any of the system variables. We haven't even processed our persisted variables. At that time, this component is loaded. And it can be loaded because it's not dependent on any services that is provided by server.
I remember making a feature request. I tried to load some components so they wouldn't load earlier. You couldn't also, I mean, you fix this now. You couldn't you couldn't force the components to be loaded because there was no way to from the
I have a slide for this. Yeah. All right. The location of this component, the manifest file, is right alongside MySQL binary because that's the only location we can access and we can trust because it's always a privileged location. Optionally, you can put it alongside your data directory. So you can tell the global manifest file to go look for the local one and then read all the values from the local. Similarly, on the component side, you have configuration file because you cannot depend on server for any configuration. So you need a configuration file to configure your keyring component as well. And any binary which is implementing minimal chassis can actually load keyring component. And we have a concept in our packages. We have a keyring migration binary which can load all the component without using any infrastructure for server. Right. So, is that it? What we get out of it is that we load keyring very, very early. And that provides us ability to encrypt and store our persisted variable as well. So we introduced a new category of variable which is called sensitive variables. This is an infrastructure change. Any plugin or any component can define a variable as sensitive. If the keyring is available, because it is loaded very early in the startup sequence, the persisted file can then use it to store or retrieve a variable which is encrypted. Especially useful for configuration variables, something like password, which is very common in case of authentication plugins like LDAP or PAM, where you need to expose those. But is that really it? Can we get something more out of it? And that's what Simon was asking about. You can actually use the manifest file to load any plugin. It's any component. It's not just the keyring. The only thing that you have to take care of is that that component cannot use any service that is provided by server. So it should be completely self-sufficient.
There was an issue with the Dragnet logging plugin that it could not be configured on initial server bootstrapping because you needed to go and load the components and therefore it wasn't working. It sounds like maybe this is a way.
Yeah. So you have to just make sure that your component is self-sufficient. As long as it is, it should just work. That's why it's bring your config. You can't rely on servers for anything. By the way, one thing is a component can be any shared library, all right? It doesn't need to provide any service. So you can load any shared library with this feature. Right. So moving on to the next one, which is communication security improvements. You are increasingly moving towards yes.
Yeah, sorry, just quickly. You mentioned that there's a restriction when you load a component very early. Like it needs to be self-contained. That doesn't mean that it cannot expose your information to a common schema to take it that.
No, you cannot.
You cannot.
Yeah, you cannot. You can have a loose dependency saying, if I find performance schema service, I will expose this details in performance schema, but you cannot have a hard dependency that this component must have a performance schema service up and running before it can be loaded. All right. So the next one is about communication security. We are increasingly moving toward OpenSSL 3.0. Before 3.0, we were not reading the global OpenSSL configuration file. Now we are. If the MySQL server is compiled using 3.0, we will rely on the system configuration of OpenSSL, which allows us to load, for example, FIPS module by default without having to tell MySQL server that, okay, load FIPS module. We also simplified few things. We improved performance. We reduce number of contexts to be created when you are generating a digest, creating an encryption, doing a decryption, so on and so forth. In this exercise, we also found a bug in OpenSSL that the modern API of OpenSSL, the VEP APIs, are quite slower than the deprecated API. This has been reported to OpenSSL. They have acknowledged it. No plan to fix it currently. So MySQL, for time being, has reverted to those legacy APIs, at least for SHA-2 and MD5 digest generation. Again, as with everything else, we get something more with it. So as we are moving toward OpenSSL 3, we get stronger support for ciphers. We get faster ciphers with OpenSSL 3. So we have now restricted. How many of you are configuring their own cipher on either server side or client side, or just relying on you are? So you may have to just check the documentation. Many things will not work because we now only use AEAD ciphers, which is GCM or CCM, only with SHA-2 family of digest. So yeah, you may have some surprises if you are using, for example, Camellia or SHA-1 based cipher. All right. Migration to component is one more aspect that we have undertaken in the last 2 years. Primarily because, we have to eat our own dog food. We have been promoting components for quite some time. So unless we use it, there's no point. So all keyrings have been migrated to components except keyring OKB, which is work in progress. This includes both commercial and enterprise keyrings. We also converted our password validation, data masking, and enterprise encryption function to component, which I plugged in before. The server is now generating audit events in terms of component service events. It's not generating plugin events anymore. This is not to say that audit plugin has been converted to component, but it's just that the infrastructure to generate event is now component based. And what it allows us is stuff like connection control, which is a plugin to protect against denial of service, is now a component.
The question remains, you can now bootstrap components for an initial server install from my.cnf. Because the problem is if you've got components you want to bootstrap when the server starts, right now you have to bootstrap the server the first time, then go install components. But I want you to bootstrap and load the components.
Not yet.
You still can't do that.
No.
Apart from 60 years ago.
The only thing now is manifest file, which
But that won't bootstrap components.
it will bootstrap your component.
Okay.
but it cannot use any other component that's
So
provided by
the
Smart.
component has to be completely, absolutely isolated from anything else in the
Or it should have a loose dependence. That if I find this service, I will use it. If I don't, I
Okay, I
will.
can do something, right?
Yeah, but we have more than 200 services now in our repository. Something related to security is event tracking services, which are basically all the audit plugin equivalent services, which are all in place now. Server is generating this event even now. So you can implement one or more of these services in a component, and then you can utilize. For example, you can implement the connection event and start logging all the connections that are coming to the server. You can start logging in, okay, how many failures you are getting or how many success you are getting from different users.
So this is actually much more lightweight than the current audit. Like,
Yes, you can pick and choose. You can say, okay, I'm just interested in connection event, nothing else.
Yeah.
And you will only get notification about connection event.
So you register for events effectively of specific types of things that happen like that.
Yeah. Audit did have that, but
It was more wrapping around us.
more wrapping around. Right. Similar thing, password validation component services, do try it out. I have something about this in FOSDEM, so please plan to attend as well. And one piece of suggestion, if you are thinking about implementing components, take a look at our Oxygen document, because that's much more elaborate. It is much more dev-friendly rather than our traditional MySQL document, which is not written with component developer in mind at this point of time. So, right. Finally, some general improvements. This is something that I could not find a specific category from, so all dumped in one section. We have introduced a key derivation function support in AES encrypt and AES decrypt. So you can now use KDF instead of a simple mechanism which we used to have, which was like XORing the actual key. So uses OpenSSL APIs. You can configure the number of iterations. The only caveat is that you need to remember salt information and the iteration count that you provided while you are performing the encryption, because the same thing is required when you are doing the decryption. Audit firewall and data masking plugin, again, all enterprise now comes with support for a configurable schema. So all the metadata table can be pushed to a separate database rather than being a part of MySQL schema. Allows more control over this, because often at times in order to, let's say, do a data import, you require more permission, like insert on this table. And it's a good practice to move them away from MySQL schema. Last but not the least, deprecations and removal. Native password is finally gone, deprecated in 8.0, disabled by default in 8.4, and may it rest in peace, 9.0. So if you are still using native password, I strongly suggest move to caching SHA-2. I already talked about keyring. We have also deprecated flush privileges, by the way. We realize that now everybody is using create, alter, drop, so on and so forth. So there's no need for flush privilege anymore. Some point of time we'll remove it completely.
So what happens if you change the MySQL table grant tables?
Still it's supported. It's just deprecated. So you can still use flush privilege. But
No,
it's,
but if I actually modify the MySQL grant tables, which sometimes has been done, then presumably the system's not aware of that, doesn't recognize that, and flush privileges anyway based on those changes.
So as of now, you will have to do flush privilege after you do those changes.
Yeah.
But there are plans to stop those things, because you should use DDL. There are cache updates attached with every change you make in ACL tables. So once that happens, there will be no need for
And
flush.
also, it'd be really useful to be able to bulk and change from grants,
Okay.
because if we want to make a large number of changes, it's better to do it because each grant is a right to database, a sync and everything else. We've got replication. If you do a bulk change, maybe it's bigger, but maybe it's more optimizable if you're making multiple changes at once.
Okay. Yeah. And we also deprecated some legacy behavior. I don't know how many of you are using it, but if you have same username, you are? Okay.
So the percent wildcards, we're not used much, but we're using
Yeah, so-
work around.
So it will, So at some point of time, it will stop inheriting permissions from person because you have roles. If you want to inherit permission, use roles. And we have also deprecated the usage of underscore and percent in the DB grants. It's already not supported if you have partial revoke on. I mean, those are considered as characters. They are now deprecated. There is no formal warning because it's going to trigger a hell lot of noise in the system, but consider them deprecated. And finally, the FIPS mode is now read-only because we tend to rely on the system config for the FIPS configuration, expect it to be set once and then be there forever, because unless you are experimenting, once the FIPS is set, you are not likely going to touch that parameter. So that's about it. Thank you.